Hi guys, and welcome to episode 3 of the Behind the Frame series. So to everyone that follows me on Instagram and took part in the poll that I ran on whether you would prefer to have a black and white conversion or a feature on localized adjustments, it was so close that I decided to combine the two. So for today's image, we're going to have a look at a young leopard that was photographed in the Okavango Delta. We were at Chitabi Camp during our Botswana wilderness safari last year. And this little guy was resting in deep shade, as you can see here. So I really liked this image. What drew my attention to the scene was this localized patch of light falling on the face. Now, the most important thing to remember here is that had this patch of light been falling on the body and the back here, and the head was a little bit further forward in the shade here, it's not going to work. Remember that our eye is drawn to the brightest part of a scene, brightest and sharpest part of a scene. So by virtue of the fact that light is falling straight through the tree here and falling directly onto the little guy's face and onto that paw, it allows us to kind of work the scene and be drawn straight there. If you have a look carefully, though, you'll see that it's more on the kind of shoulder and the top side of the face, obviously this side being a little bit darker. Not ideal, but we can work around that. So what I'm going to do for today's image, just quickly before we go through the technical specs, is we're going to look at the image has already been processed. And I'm going to go through and switch on the adjustments that I've made and then talk you through those at each step. So first of all, looking at the technical specs, ISO 1000 taken at 560 mils. So this was with the 400mm f2.8 lens and the 1.4 converter applied. f4 and 1,250th of a second. Now, why f4? Well, obviously we want a very shallow depth of field, focusing directly onto the cub's face. And if you have a look here, lovely detail in the face and in the whiskers. And then you can see the depth of field starting to drop off a little bit on the shoulder already. The reason we want to shoot at f4 is to try and blur all of this foreground as much as possible. So we've got these massive branches leading in front of the leopard, and this to me shows a little bit more of a shy and secretive nature of these beautiful cats. Why does the image work? Well, we've already spoken about the fact that we've got almost a key lighting falling onto our subject, which is great. Excuse me. And the eye contact. So there's a little bit of light in that eye of this leopard and obviously looking directly at us. So this is the before. Now, this works equally well as a color as well as a black and white image, and this is something that you need to think about when converting to black and white. A lot of people say, does color play a role in the image? If not, then convert it to black and white. Now, I want to show you today why color in an image, when you're working in black and white, is actually vitally important. So obviously the most effective shortcut to convert an image into black and white using Lightroom's automatic recipe mix is the letter V, and that will convert it into a black and white image. If we have a look at some of the basic adjustments here, pull down the highlights. So obviously with that bright sky in the background there, we pull back those highlights a little bit. And so we're working now in black and white. What we've also done here is, before we go too far, we've lifted the whites a little bit. We're going to go into our special adjustment brush, and you'll see these little pins over here show you that I have applied 3 localized adjustments. Now, typically in the order of working through this, I do all my global adjustments first and then come back and do these localized adjustments. But because I'm showing you what has already been done, I need to go and do this stage now. So the first thing is, let's have a look at the bottom here. We've got the little switch where we can switch off our adjustments. So this is before the brush adjustments, and this is after the brush adjustments. Now, it's very obvious as to what's been done with these brushes and why. And this is what you've got to think about when it comes to your editing, is what is my story here? How can I use the tools available to me to make the story even stronger? So if I have a look at without these adjustments, yes, I'm drawn directly to the face of the leopard because that's the brightest part, but I'm also drawn to this paw over here. And then just looking around, this little bright patch of light falling onto this tree stump in the foreground here, that is detracting. And so remember that our eye is drawn to the brightest parts. So initially we go to the leopard, but then we start to drift, maybe up to the top left, up to the top here, maybe along these branches down here. And so our localized adjustments are going to be in line with trying to draw down those areas, dial them down in the frame, and dial up the presence of the leopard. So if I switch those adjustments back on, you can see how immediately we locked back in. So let's have a look at those adjustments. The first brush is around here. So these are two areas with similar sort of exposure in the scene, and so we can work them with the same brush. The effects that I've applied here, so remembering now that once you've got your brush, you have the size of the brush. Just as a little tip, you can use your square brackets to adjust the size of this brush. I always work with a very large feather. You can see the feather slider over here, and a flow of 20. Now the flow, what that means is if this was up at 100 and you take a brush stroke, let me just show you quickly here. If you take your flow up to 100, a value of 100, and you do a brush stroke, hitting O to show our overlay, the effect that you want will be applied at 100%. So you can see now how that's been applied. At a flow of 20, I can, rather than applying the whole effect at one shot, I can go over the same area. That's a single brush stroke, and you'll see it's very, very subtle. I can go over the same area again and again and again, eventually building that up to a point where it's at the same stage and the same amount of the effect as if we just went in at 100. Now the reason for doing that is you'll see that when we have a look over here, using a flow of 20, I brushed in these areas. So I haven't applied the full effect. If I go over this again and again, it'll start to build up and apply more and more of the effect and into these areas. But you'll see that it fades off the edge here. So it doesn't leave a very hard edge. What you don't want to do when you're doing localized adjustments is to leave a hard, discernible edge. And you can see it very clearly. I don't use the auto mask feature in a scene like this. I very rarely use it, in fact, because of that exact reason. I find that it leaves hard edges. The other way that you can be guaranteed to leave hard edges is if you are very aggressive in your exposure adjustments. It just doesn't make sense that there's a 2 or 3 stop difference between light at one point of a frame and the next. It can become unnatural. So I like to use a flow value, depending on where I'm working, of sort of 30, 40, and then build it up to really just apply the effect. So what have we done to these areas that are now highlighted in red? Remembering the shortcut O for overlay to show or hide that. What we've done is we've dropped the exposure quite a bit. We've pulled back the highlights. We've dropped the whites. And we've also dropped the blacks and the clarity. So obviously, if we make things sharper and darker here, more punchy, our eye is going to be drawn there. So what we've done is we've made it a little bit softer so that it doesn't compete for our eye as much as our sharp area, which is obviously on the leopard. Let's have a look at the adjustments that we've made on the leopard. Okay, so around the eye, around the facial area, and down and along the paw. What have we done here? We've dropped the exposure by 2/3 of a stop, and we've dropped the highlights by a value of -25. Now, it should be fairly obvious to you if we come back here and switch our adjustments on and off again. If you have a look, that face and that shoulder is very, very bright. So by dialing in those values and dropping the exposure around that shoulder and the face and along the paw down here, we've actually been able to bring back detail into that area, as well as just make it not as bright and really striking as it normally is. So having a look at this, if we go back to our adjustment brush on our leopard's face, and we come back and we switch these on, what we're going to do here, I just want to have a look. This area around the paw, you can see, is still very bright. So I just want to go on and, again, just reducing the size of my brush, go over this area and just reduce, build up more of the effect into this little section over here. And so that we can then just pull back those highlights just even more. If we switch off our overlay, we can now see the effect, and that's looking good. This localized adjustment brush, obviously, just each time that you want to add a new adjustment to an area, you can go and click on a new brush over here. So this little adjustment brush that we've got over here, you can see that that's now working the side of the face that's in a little bit of shadow. And what we've done there is been quite aggressive on the exposure. This is very aggressive, but if you have a look at the overall image, it doesn't look too unnatural. So if we go again and we switch off all of these adjustments that we've done using our localized adjustment brush, that's before and that's after. And what I want to draw your attention to here is that when you look at the image before, there's a lot going on. You go into the face and then you start to explore around. Now, don't worry about the absolute final overall appeal of the image. We're going to get there now. But what I want you to see is that with these adjustments made, what we've done is we've dialed you into the leopard's face. So we've made everything outside of that leopard's face less appealing to the eye so that you're actually locked on there. And what you'll find is that if you have a look at the before image, you find your eye wandering out to the top left-hand side of the frame and up to the top right. But once we've applied these adjustments, you should be locked into the face of the leopard. And so that's really what you should be thinking about when you're using localized adjustments is, what is my goal? How can I make the story of this image that much stronger? So let's close up those localized adjustments now. We've had a look at our basic adjustments. We're going to go to the tone curve. Just a little trick and tip here as well. If you right click on any gray part of this panel here, you can switch on solo mode. And what that means is that when you open one panel, everything else closes. So you will only have one panel open at a time. Very handy. So again, the tone curve, looking at regional contrast in tonal ranges. So this is before we've applied any tone curve adjustments. And now we're going to switch those back on, and you can see what we've done is we've lifted the lights, so we've stretched out the brightest lights and the darkest lights to add a little bit more contrast in that range, and we've darkened the darks and our shadows, so before and after. And you can very clearly see that the before image is almost very gray and washed out. It doesn't quite have the nice deep contrast that you want to. And what happens is the contrast between this dark branch with all of that lovely texture and the bright areas where the light is falling on our subject just becomes that much more prominent in the frame. So that's our tone curve and our localized, our tonal contrast. We're going to go into the black and white mix now. And this is also a very important part. Before we do anything, when you hit V and you tell Lightroom convert this image into black and white, it throws an automatic color channel mix here. And this is where we talk about color being important in a black and white image. So I'm going to switch on the adjustments that I've made here. And what you will see is that before and after. So before, these leaves hold a lot more weight in the image, so they draw your eye there because they are fairly bright. Now, if I turn this back into color at this point, you'll see that the greens and the blues are around the back end of this image here, so around these leaves and that sky. And so what happens is when I come into my black and white mix, I have the ability to adjust the various color ranges in an image in terms of how bright or how dark they are. So if Lightroom had given me a standard mix of something like this, where I want to now dial back those leaves and make them a little bit darker, and the same with the sky. If you have a look at the blue area in the sky there, rather than having those highlights, obviously you don't want to get to an area where your pixels become artifacted like this. We're just going to slowly but surely just bring down those blues so that they become less intrusive, and so our eye is then only drawn to the leopard. Now our subject, the leopard, being orange and yellow, we can adjust these as well. So if you wanted to really dial up the leopard's presence, probably more on the yellow channel, you'll see that we start to affect some of the surrounding areas as well. So double clicking that. And so using the color mix, again, similar to a localized adjustment brush, but without really having to go and color in and select each and every detail, you can start to change the brightness or the darkness of specific color ranges in an image. Detail, obviously what we're going to do in this section here is mask and sharpen. So again, masking out to a value of about 80 or so. You'll see that if we go any further lower here, we're going to start to sharpen areas of the image which we specifically chose to leave soft and out of focus, drawing our attention only to our subject here, and sharpening to an amount of 37. And then as a finishing touch, I mentioned this in the last episode as well, applying a subtle vignette which darkens the edges of the frame and then just makes the center of the frame hold a little bit more weight when it comes to viewing the image. And we switch that adjustment back on, and you'll see that the outside edges of the frame have been darkened. So this is without the vignette, and that's with the vignette. So overall, what we've done is we've darkened the edges with the vignette, but also with some localized adjustments. We've recovered some of the highlights that were on the very bright highlights on the shoulder, and we've lifted the presence of some of the shadowed areas on the faces. Now, as a complete before and after image, this was the original shot as it was taken, and that's after. And I love to cycle through these views just to kind of bring myself back into check and make sure that I haven't really pushed it too far, that there's nothing in the frame that looks unnatural to the eye. And so I hope that you would agree with me that the localized adjustments that I've made here are in line with dialing up the story and not changing the content at all. And that you can understand how color plays an important role in converting a black and white image. So that's it for episode 3 of Behind the Frame. I'm going to be recording another episode today because I'm heading off to the States on Sunday, but I hope you guys are enjoying the series. As always, if you have any questions, would like me to feature something, or would like me to just elaborate on something, give me a shout and let me know. Cheers.